this image of her. So we'll come up to you and some of the pics.
Told her she was so ugly she'd never find a man and would spend her whole life locked in an attic, pining away, in loneliness. And then her father died of alcoholism and addiction when she was 10. She was sort of passed around between families, was very shy, didn't have any friends really, until her aunt took pity on her and shipped her off to London to go to a school for girls. How many people in here, anybody in here a tennis freak?
Tennis?
Okay, no tennis. Anybody in here know what Wimbledon is? Okay, it's like the major tennis court in the universe. Well, the women play on the court now where Eleanor's childhood school was. And so when I see Venus and Serena and other players knocking the stuffing out of a ball, I think of Eleanor at Allenswood really learning from Mademoiselle Cheveste, because what Mademoiselle Cheveste taught her was how to argue. And I try it. Sometimes I'm really good at it, and sometimes it's like, don't even ask me. But she said to Eleanor, you will never know what you really think until you can argue both sides of an issue with equal conviction. In other words, treat your fiercest critic to help her find her granny, because she thought she was so ugly and that she would, never find a man, and and that Eleanor couldn't compare to Anna, her mother's beauty, and what an embarrassment that was to her. Her father gave her the exact opposite. He called her his darling little Nell, after their favorite Dickens character, and so she worshiped him. But, he got hurt in an accident. He became addicted to morphine, and he drank, and he constantly disappointed her. So there's always this. And there is, I would say, a preponderance of evidence that my friend Blanche Cook uncovered that I believe indicates that there were some drunk uncles who also sexually abused her. We know that the only place that she felt safe after her parents died and she's living with her grandmother is climbing a cherry tree and just staying at the top of the cherry tree. We also know that her uncles would get drunk and they had .22 caliber rifles and they would take pot shots around her just to have some fun. So she had to, she writes a young boy, a word I use with precision. He's in the first grade, he's black, he's from Tennessee. I have no idea if he's 6 or 7. I just know he's in Tennessee. And his parents have relocated from the north to Tennessee. And he goes to get a drink of water. And there are those paper cone cups, that look like ice cream cones by the thing. And so he gets one, and he doesn't realize that he's getting it from not the colored fountain. And so he gets beat. He gets beat up, and he bleeds on the cup. And he wrote a letter to Eleanor in the first grade on that, lined big paper that you write, and he's trying so hard to write neatly that he's pushing the pencil in so hard that it indents the paper and it indents the photograph that he sends Eleanor himself, and he sends her the cup, and he tells her this story. And so she writes him back. And I think this is indicative of answering your question. She said, I can only imagine the fear that you feel. School is supposed to be a safe place. But I learned from a lifetime of disappointment and a childhood that challenged me that courage is more exhilarating than fear. And all we have to have is the courage to look ourselves in the mirror and take one step at a time. And so I think that's what she taught herself. I think she learned some of that from her uncle Theodore Roosevelt, who became president and who was, a great macho Rough Rider and athlete despite having really bad asthma. And so he loved her, but he would do things like she learned to swim because he just picked her up and threw her in the lake. I mean, he didn't tell her, how to move your arms, he just threw her in the lake. So she was always trying to figure out how to stay afloat.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask too, what you see as maybe some important turning points in her life up through the time that she becomes First Lady. I don't know if you're...
Am I working? Yeah, okay. I really don't need a mic. I can yell so you can hear me all the way in Soldier
I think it's for the
Field.
live stream.
But I think Allenswood was definitely a big one because she made friends. And she later said the happiest day of her life was when she was elected captain of the field hockey team. So that was, a really big thing for her. Falling in love with FDR was a huge change. We think of FDR now as a man who is always in his wheelchair or standing with the assistance of braces. When Eleanor met FDR, he was a hunk. He was tall, he was patrician, he had great charm. He was what they called a dandy, or what I would call today a pretty boy. You know what I mean? I mean, somebody who's so stylishly full of himself and think he owns the world that you just like, oh God, I don't have time for you. But, they saw something in each other. And he did not take Eleanor's seriousness as a flaw. He saw it as somebody that he could open up to and express his ambitions to. And so that was a turning point. Having 5 children in 10 years was a real turning point because she had come back from London reluctantly because she wanted to stay in Allenswood. And Mademoiselle Schwartz had said the summer before, when Eleanor did not want to go home, you can stay with me, we can travel, but you have to learn to do 3 things. You have to learn to be independent and live on a budget. So you have to book all our travel, arrange all our stays, and keep our expenses within this budget. The second thing, when you go to a different country, it is the height of arrogance to expect them to speak to you in English. You must try to learn the language of the people that you visit. a parenthesis. When Eleanor died in 1962 at the age of 78, she could speak 6 languages and was learning Swahili when tuberculosis just took her over. And the third thing that she said was, when you're in a different country, you are a visitor, you are a guest, and so you help. Just like you clear the table of dishes when you're in somebody's house, you volunteer in the communities. And so Eleanor volunteered in hospitals, she volunteered in disease clinics, she volunteered in settlement communities, she works with immigrant communities. And in fact, her first passion were the rights of immigrants. And it is the one constant that will stay through her until her death in 1962. So that was a big thing. Then, FDR gets polio, and then he gets polio right when she has become sort of a person in her own right, in terms of an organizer. She's working with immigrant issues. She's become very active in the aftermath of World War I. She's toured battlefields with FDR in 1919, the year before, 2 years before polio strikes him. And she sees what happens when there's a land war, a ground war, where buildings are just erased, where woods are burned down, where there's so many bodies they can't be buried. And one of the things that she does is she sees mounds of bodies. And before there are dog tags, there are other types of IDs on bodies. And so she goes in there to collect the IDs because the soldiers are going to be put in mass graves, respectfully, but so that she can contact the family. And so the horror of war is really exposed to her, and she becomes very active. She runs the women's division of the Democratic Party in New York right after FDR loses the 1920 election, where he would have become Vice President of the United States. She's very involved in labor organizations, and then polio strikes. So she has to figure out how to help advance FDR's recovery and help keep his dreams of political office alive in a way that allows her some freedom as well. And so when he becomes, by the time he becomes governor, Al Smith, who preceded him as governor and who will run for president in 1928, tells his close aide that we must have Frank, meaning FDR, on the ticket to run for governor in New York because his wife is more well-known among the party faithful than anyone in the state. Wow. And so when he becomes governor, she's got to figure out again how to continue to do all her work while he is in Albany in the governor's mansion. And so she continues to work with a lot of nonprofits and what today we would call NGOs, and then she teaches. And she teaches civics and history and literature. And her whole thing is to turn her 20 students into 20 women activists. They go to prisons, they go to homeless shelters, they go to juvenile court, they go to adult court, they sit in law school. And she says, and she teaches them, encourages them to get to know the people that they work with and to begin to think in different ways. But the real challenge is when FDR is elected president, because she does not want to be first lady.
She doesn't want to be first lady, but at the same time, she's sort of been building this political base through the 1920s. And so it seems that fairly soon after entering the White House, she decides that this is going to be a place where she'll try to exercise
No,
her
FDR
influence.
shuts her down.
Well, he shuts her down with the,
I
yeah,
mean,
with the mail, but
because she says to FDR, let me help you with your mail,
right.
which other women have done. Nope. Let me help you with your calendar, which all the members of Congress who were married, most of their wives were in their offices because Congress did not have the staff in 1932 that they have now. And he says no. And she says, well, let me travel around for you. And he says no. And so she writes her daughter and says that living in the White House fills her with the greatest sense of possible dread because she does not want to be confined to a lifetime of teas and white glove tests, meaning you have you put on a white glove and you go around and you do that and you think, dust, we got to get somebody to go clean that. And so she, even though she holds her own press conferences, she is really confined to the White House until Louis Howe, who is FDR's great advisor, sort of think of David Axelrod with Obama or Stephen Miller to Trump, or comes to her and says, "You got to get out of here. I'm tired of you walking around like a frump." And so they drive around Washington, no Secret Service, no press following them, and she wants to go to the Bonus Army encampment, which is a homeless encampment of veterans from World War I who've lost everything in the Great Depression, many of whom have walked from California to D.C. to try to lobby to get their bonuses. Hoover, who was president before FDR, had sent MacArthur, Patton, and Eisenhower to dislodge them. The camps are burned, 3 people are killed, and it's a public relations nightmare. But she stays in the camp. She's in the camp for 5 hours. She even goes into a tent and takes off her chemise. What do you call them now? The frilly little T-shirts that you can buy now that you wear when your shirts are open. Whatever you call them now. Like a T-strap, that's it, a T-strap. Okay, takes it off and gives it to a woman whose clothes are so threadbare that you can see her nipples. And she eats beans with her fingers. She sings camp songs with the guys, and then they go back. And the next day, the Washington Post, which was the number 3 newspaper then in D.C., says this. They interview the rumor mill gets around, and so the reporters come, talk to the Bonus Army campers, and one guy said, Hoover sent the troops, FDR sent his wife. The next day, FDR says to her, you can travel. But she had to prove her value.
Oh, interesting. So I wanted to talk about some of her issues or passions as she was First Lady. We can start with any one of them. There are many of them, but maybe you've mentioned immigration, so perhaps we could start there and then delve into civil rights and labor rights, women's rights.
Well, Marie Chuvest first really exposed her to the challenges that immigrants face in Europe, especially in London, France, Germany, and Austria. And so when she comes back home, after she graduates from Allenswood, she carries a letter with her from Marie Chuvest that Eleanor will have with her her entire life. And it says, you know, I'm paraphrasing the first part, of course you must go home and make your debut. After all, you are Roosevelt. But first and foremost, you are my Eleanor, and I expect great things from you in your own right. And so when she goes back home, she, has to do all these upper-class social events, go to, big formal dances and all this other stuff. But during the day, she's volunteering in settlement communities. And if you've, in New York, when Eleanor was doing that, there really wasn't indoor plumbing or effective sewage. So you would walk through the streets and there would be rotting garbage, excrement, urine from where people dumped their buckets because there were no toilets. And she would have to walk up 4 and 5 flights to, meet with some of the families that she'd grown close to. And, she'd have to walk over excrement. And FDR rarely gave Eleanor credit for anything, but he did say that she absolutely was the one who introduced him to poverty. And so from her experience at Allenswood and in the settlement communities, she's also greatly affected by, although she did not see it, by stories from the Great Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, where women literally were locked in rooms where their sewing machines were, and the buildings caught on fire, and they either burned to death or jumped out of a 5th floor window. And so that becomes her first real commitment to activism. And through that, she meets 2 Russian and German Jewish immigrants, Maud Schwartz and Rose Schneiderman. And Rose Schneiderman is one of the great labor leaders of all times. And so they school Eleanor in labor issues. She becomes very involved in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. She meets other labor leaders, and then they help her learn their languages, so much so that by the Second World War, Eleanor is involved in the International Committee, the International Working Women's Committee, where she is translating for immigrant activists who are involved in the war effort or trying to get their issues addressed at home. And it will stay with her forever. The last time she testifies before Congress will be in 1962, when she's arguing that farm workers deserve to be covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which are minimum wage and maximum hours a work week. So it's something that stays with her. It stays with her through the Depression. She's very concerned about internment. She loses that argument. She does shut up about it for 18 months, but she slips some and says, "It chills my soul to think of American children behind barbed wire." She adopts Japanese American families who are interned. She tries to get FDR to change his position and let Japanese men who want to volunteer in the Army fight. So it's a constant theme for her, and it surfaces again, most importantly for our lives, it surfaces again in 1946 when she is appointed to be a member of the first American delegation to the United Nations. I mean, it's the first time the General Assembly has met. The UN's trying to figure out how to do its job. There are between, on the low end, 40 million and 60 million displaced people in Europe. I want you to think about that. 60 million people displaced. That's like all of Chicago, all of New York, all of Atlanta, all of San Francisco, all of Houston, and all of Los Angeles together. And the guys on the delegation are all focused on how to deal with the bomb, you know, because we just have the atomic bomb, and how to set up the Security Council when the immigration crisis in Europe is the most threatening, destabilizing issues, because the Soviets want to take all the people that have been displaced and are in territories that are under their control to move them back to the Soviet Union, because 40 million Soviets died in the war, 20 million soldiers and 20 million Russians through both the war in Russia and Stalin's purges. And she ends up debating Wyszynski, the big Russian delegate, who was sort of like Obama with James Earl Jones's voice. And the guys are stunned. And they come up to her, John Foster Dulles comes up to her and says, "Mrs. Roosevelt, when you were appointed, I thought it was just awful. But I must say your work here today has been very fine." And so Eleanor writes, a dear friend, Joseph Flash, that night, "Against the odds, the women move forward, but I'm fairly old to be carrying on this fight." But because of her stance in the General Assembly on that, every nation but one in the UN drafts her to become chair of the committee that will, the Commission on Human Rights, that will ultimately draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Only one country doesn't want her to do it. Anybody got any ideas who it is? Us! Oh my God, she's too liberal, she's mushy-headed, you know, she's not a lawyer. She had 1, 2, 3, 4 years of school. I'm not talking college, I'm not talking graduate school, I'm talking a total of 4 years of school. But she knew how to listen, she knew how to meet people where they were, and she had indomitable energy. And immigration is the theme that runs all through that.
I think most people know her partly because of her advocacy for civil rights at a time when that was extremely unusual for anyone in high-level position in the government. So could you talk a little bit about her work on civil rights in the 30s and 40s?
Sure. Well, she comes to civil rights very slowly. There were no black servants in her community. There were no black servants or free black people in Europe that she hung around with. On her mother's side, there's this great South Carolina heritage. So as she fully admits later in life that she was so ill-informed that she thought slaves sang because they were happy. Once she gets it, she will risk herself so much that people try to kill her 16 times. The Ku Klux Klan places the largest bounty or reward for anybody who would kidnap her or kill her that they had ever placed in its history. The director of the FBI, as I said earlier, wants to ship her out of the country because he's convinced her outspokenness means that she has colored blood, that she's trying to pass, therefore she's really a communist. so we got to get her out of the country and send her to Liberia. So how does she make this progression? She meets Mary McLeod Bethune. And if you don't know who Mary McLeod Bethune is, you got to go home and read about her, because she is one tough mama. I used to argue before the Twin Towers in New York fell that the two titans of the 20th century were Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt. Mary McLeod Bethune was one of 16, I think, children born into slavery. She's the youngest. She got out. She was passionately committed to education, founds Bethune-Cookman College, which is still in existence today as a HBCU. And ironically, Eleanor meets Bethune through Franklin's mother, who was giving money to support Bethune's school. Bethune is fierce. She would not stop. She was very proper, but very strong in demeanor and in appearance. She was short, rotund, very bad asthmatic, walked with a cane, but stood up to leaders around the world and convinced FDR when he was president, thanks to Eleanor's advocacy, that there should be, quote unquote, a black cabinet. And she was the highest appointed black person in the history of the in the federal government when FDR appointed her in 1935 to run the minority youth division of the National Youth Administration. Bethune was very active in the NAACP. She was very supportive of A. Philip Randolph and the Sleeping Car Porters Union, which was the most important black union in the United States. And she taught Eleanor. And so when Eleanor begins to travel after the Bonus Army encampment, she travels alone, without Secret Service, sometimes drives her own car, on a train, anybody could come talk to her. And when she would go in different cities, she would see if the New Deal was working. She would also go to black churches, black schools, black civic associations. And so she got a sense of what discrimination was like. And she believed so strongly, as the economy went into the toilet in the 30s, was that the lessons of World War I is that we won the war, but we lost the peace. That she begins to say, she begins to speak out for voting rights. She speaks out against the poll tax. She speaks out on equal funding for education in schools that refuse to integrate. But by 1939, she is advocating for integrated schools, both in the North and in the South. And she will hold the North just as accountable for their social discrimination as she holds the South accountable for racial discrimination, which leads hundreds of people to write her and to ask her on her radio show, do you support intermarriage, which was the big trans issue of the day. And Eleanor is very close to Walter White, who is head of the NAACP, and his wife is white. And she has other friends who are interracial couples. And she knows the violence that they encounter. And so while she says it should not be illegal, as it was in most states in the United States, but that she worries about the safety of interracial couples because of the consistent biases that they would face. And so she really cautions people to really be careful about it.
I think,
And the first decision she makes after she leaves the White House is to join the board of directors of the NAACP, which it was when it was then a really kick-ass organization.
I think many people maybe are not aware, too, of the amount of work she did with youth and how passionate she became about the youth movement, especially in the mid to late 1930s. So I'm wondering if you could just speak about that a little bit, since we have so many young people here. And
if Eleanor was on this stage, she would pay more attention to you than any of the adults in the room. She thought in 1961 and 1962, when she's dying, even when John Kennedy is president, that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have lost their souls, that it's the young people in America who really have the courage to seize the hope that is necessary to build the American dream. She says we are all on trial to show what democracy means, and that freedom may fade or grow, dependent upon the action that young people take. And she, I can give you political reasons why she says this, because the issues to which she's devoted her life after the White House are, in fact, the issues of young people. You know, it's peace, how to prevent another war. It's how do you fund college? How do you care for young children with daycare, now that the one daycare bill that was established to help women who worked in the defense industries had lapsed? She founds Roosevelt University. You know, she supports the founding of Roosevelt University, even though FDR was adamant that there should be nothing named for him or built for him other than this small desk-sized marble cube in front of the National Archives. You know, she said, he would love it, but most importantly of all, you know, the future belongs to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams, which she never said. I'm just telling you. She never. It was somebody putting words in her mouth, you know, but she would see you as careful observers. She would be all over you to pay attention to what's happening, to learn to argue both sides of an issue, and to not give up. Because she took her courage later in life from young people, especially young people who were involved in Americans for Democratic Action, in the National Youth Associations, and from young people who were beginning to get involved in the civil rights movement. She was a founding member of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality, which did all the freedom rides. She raised money for the freedom rides. She held workshops at Valkill, her country home in New York, for student leaders like Alan Lowenstein and others who wanted to conduct organizing workshops, for student divisions of labor, for student divisions of the NAACP. And she wanted to learn from them, but also help teach them the skills that she had learned after a lifetime of being attacked in public. So if immigration, excuse me, was the consistent issue thread in her life, the group that she bonded with the most were young people. I mean, even when FDR made her stop teaching, when she's in the White House, she's continually bringing students into the White House. She goes and talks to young people on trains. There's this great story of she met this guy on a train, and one day, he said, "Oh, well, you got to come see me, Mrs. Roosevelt, if you're ever back in town." And so she's in town, and she finds his dorm, and she walks into the dorm and goes and knocks on his door, and he's playing cards in there. And so, she begins to hang with him for the evening and meet friends and figure out what they are working on. And her most fascinating, unsolicited correspondence. In other words, like, she didn't ask you to write her. Or letters from young people, which she always read and kept notes on and would respond to. If you wrote her, you always got an answer. Never in the history of the White House had that happened before.
I guess that's the case with Polly Murray, too, the
there was
African-American activist.
There's this fabulous young woman whose name is Polly Murray, wicked smart, fierce, was trying to apply to attend the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she gets rejected. And she's furious. And so she writes FDR a letter, and she doesn't get an answer. So she copies the letter and sends it to Eleanor with a blistering letter. Eleanor writes her back. They develop a relationship that began in Polly Murray's terms as a confrontation by typewriter. They become friends until Eleanor's death. She helps Polly get into Cornell Law School. She then follows her career, invites Polly to spend the night in the White House, invites Polly and her mother to come visit her at her home in New York. When Eleanor goes to the UN, she asks Polly's opinion on certain petitions and legal positions that Eleanor wants to take. And after Eleanor is appointed by John Kennedy to chair the first Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, she appoints Polly Murray to be the senior counsel to this. A black woman lawyer, lesbian, in 1961 and 62, chairing a national commission on women. That just gives you a sense of how Eleanor would fight for people.
That's awesome. I'm just going to ask one last quick question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. If in 2 sentences you could channel Eleanor right now, here she is, what do you think she would say to people in this particular moment when we are facing so many challenges in our country? How would she attempt to inspire us?
I will quote 2 Eleanor sentences.
Perfect.
We are all on trial to show what democracy means, which she says in the Democratic Convention in 1956, when there's the big outcry over the Brown decision. She will repeatedly say that until she dies in 1962. In 1962, I think she stayed alive to finish her last book, which is called Tomorrow's Now. She was bleeding from the throat. She had to drink from a straw. She was too weak to hold any utensils. She would whisper across the table to a young woman who would take down her words in shorthand and type them up. A week before she died, before she went into hospital to die, the great labor leader Walter Reuther took his daughter to college at Vassar College, which is right down the road from Eleanor's home. He dropped by to see her because he knew she was dying, and she worshiped Walter Reuther. I really think she wanted Reuther to be president. And after he leaves, she asks for the young woman who's helping her with her book to bring her bed table, like a tray that you can eat food on in bed with the manuscript. And she takes a pencil and she writes in the margin, and other than signing her name to a thank you note for Jackie Kennedy for sending her flowers when she was dying in the hospital, this is the last sentence that she writes. Staying aloof is not a solution. It is a cowardly evasion.
Wow. Thank you, Allida. That was awesome. I think we are now open for questions from the audience, burning questions from the group.
And you guys ask me anything. If you don't believe me, it's fine. Just give me a hard time. I just have to say I'm really sorry that I can't stand up.
Yeah.
I totally wrecked my knee getting out of a cab today, and I can't stand for long. So I don't want to scream a profanity when my knee hurts. So.
And she will. We want to thank Roosevelt Security for providing the wheelchair today. All right, questions? Oh.
Yes, I have a question.
Where are you?
I'll stand up.
Okay. What's your name?
Brianna.
Hey, I'm Allida.
Hi, nice to meet you. I wanted to ask, how can Americans, in your opinion, adopt an attitude like Eleanor as far as her empathy towards the poor, other races, immigrants, and in general, speaking up for others who feel they can't?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part?
Yes, I can repeat it. I said, how can Americans, in your opinion, adopt an attitude?
Oh, I got it. How can Americans assume some of Eleanor's understanding?
Yes, basically.
I think that's the challenge of our time. We're all in such silos, and we've engaged in such purity tests that we only talk to people that we agree with a gazillion% of the time. And we have to take risks to get out of that. And we have to challenge each other to get outside ourselves and see what other people could feel or experience. I do workshops on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and maybe this is a practical way to answer your question. Article 1, which is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights and should treat one another in a spirit of reason. God, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights and should treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. That was the last article that finally got approved. It took 3,000 hours and 300 meetings to negotiate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was the last one. So if we were in a workshop, I'd put you not with people that you knew and ask you, what would you need to stay alive? You know, no iPhones, no, maybe school, but what do you need to be? And then when you write that down, and other people write that down, that's the way that you can really begin to have a conversation. Because rights right now, says she who's chugging water, have become so co-opted that the right to water means I have a right to Saratoga water in a Tiffany cut glass with ice, served on the finest silver imaginable if I'm in the middle of the desert on the top of a dune in Sahara. We have so destroyed what this concept means that we built it in a way to divide us rather than unite us. And so I think that's a way to start. Yeah. Oh, sorry. What's your name?
Jules.
Hey, Jules, I'm Allida.
I would say I have a two-part question.
Sure.
With the political climate that we are in, do you think that we as a society, be it American or universally, have lost the meaning of empathy and have gained more towards apathy towards each other?
Great question. I agree we've lost empathy. You know, but I don't think empathy is sympathy. I think empathy is really taking the time to see where somebody else is. Apathy? That's a really good question. I have to think about it for a minute. I don't think we've become apathetic. I think we've become cocooned. You know, we're all in our own little space. And the more, I think the faster we see change, the tighter that space becomes. And is this going to be on the web? Okay, I got to give you a different example. Okay, I'll give you an example when we're off cam. I'll give you that example when we're off camera. Okay, but you know, the cardinal rule of American history from the beginning of time is that when the economy shrinks, racial tensions escalate, and immigration concerns escalate. I don't think that's the only reason. I think there's that, you know, because the economy is bifurcated. I mean, it's, I think people are really nervous about job skills that they don't think they can gain, or that unnerved them in many ways. I think I've never thought we were a post-racial country. I mean, I don't care what Obama said. That was the biggest wishful thinking, come down the pikes into popsicles, you know. I also think that, you know, America's, I mean, progress is like a rubber band. You know, it's tight and then you pull it. And it's, you know, and it gets bigger. But then when you let go, it pops back. But it's still bigger than it was before. And then you just pull it until it pops. I don't think we're at the point to where it pops, but I think we are really close as to where it is that we can pop. It can pop. And I just think we have to take the time to look at each other. And I know that sounds crappy and stupid and simplistic, but if we keep putting people in boxes and just saying, okay, well, that's going to hurt me or that's going to be good for me, I mean, what do we have in common? You know, how can we look at what we have in common and still celebrate difference? Does that make sense? And that's what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does. It's what do we have in common? We all don't have to be the same. We don't have to look the same. We don't have to think the same, pray the same, act the same, love the same, work the same, whatever. But there are things to which we are all entitled because we are people. And until we start thinking about that, you know, we're going to keep yelling at each other. And it's like I'm obsessed with the sesquicentennial, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, because I don't want it to become the comic book version of what we, you know, how this got created. And, you know, and freedom in the Declaration is based on slavery. I mean, the language in the Declaration has that. That does not mean that all the signers of the Declaration supported slavery. And how does that change over time? And so one of the things that I'm really trying to figure out how to do is to do workshops on the Declaration to the Declaration. You know, the Declaration of Independence as a declaration of war. It's a declaration of beliefs, but it's issued to justify going to war. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a declaration of beliefs to prevent war. And there's similarities. So how does the Declaration of Independence change over time? What are the forces that change that help shape a universal concept of rights? And empathy is part of that. It's not just compassion, it's intellectual empathy, it's political empathy. I mean, what can we find common ground on? Did I answer your question at all?
All right, one more quick question, Spencer. Go ahead.
Yeah, what's your name?
Spencer.
Hi.
I want to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt's story. How will it impact future generations?
How has Eleanor's story impacted future generations?
Yes, how will
Okay.
it impact?
Not many people know it. I mean, they knew it when in the 50s and the 60s, she was an inspiration. You know, she was the Hillary Clinton of the 50s and the 60s. She was the Rosa Parks of the 50s and the 60s. She made a really stupid, in my opinion, decision to hold her papers back for 10 years before she gave them to the Roosevelt Library. And because she wanted her friend Joe Lash to, let's see if I can do this in my name. Ooh, you're a good influence. Could write a biography of her that really was the story that she wanted told. During that, before she gave her papers, she went through some of them and pulled out documents that she considered would make FDR look weak. And also, after she left the White House, she had one staff person helping her. And so, if you wrote her a letter, let's say in 1954, she could have either typed a letter back, and we have a carbon, or typed a letter back and sent it to you, or, God forbid, turned your letter over, wrote on the back of it, and sent it back to you. And so to reconstruct what she did, my team had to go to 253 archives in 50 states and 9 nations. Because Eleanor still believed that if people really knew what she did behind the scenes in politics and policy, that it would make FDR look weak. And so she covered her tracks. And we are now just beginning, to see her from every angle. Does that make sense? Now, my friend Michael Cooper and I have a fantasy. We want to make a movie. I want a serious movie. Michael wants Eleanor Roosevelt action hero. And so we have these, we have these running debates after several glasses of wine, which one we could get made first. But we are trying very hard to get her in curriculum. We're trying very hard to change the narrative about her. And it's coming, it's just slow.
I want to thank everybody so much for attending today and to welcome you all to a reception in the foyer. Allida will hold court sitting down, so if you'd like to come up and ask a question, please do. Thank you so much.